with this. So this is just a quick introduction to the SEDA Small Grants. Obviously you know about it because you're here, but we've been going since 2003, and the main purpose, as you can see here, is to support research and evaluation and improve the quality and understanding of educational development practices. And I think that's something that's quite a key thing here, that we're looking not necessarily at something that is sort of teaching and learning very much sort of specifically on that, but it could, for example, have a reference to what you learn as an educational developer, or doing something within a particular module that can then have implications outside that. So it's and also it's something that you are doing that's sort of new and different rather than part of your sort of everyday practice. So we'll come on to that in a moment. And as you can see here, that 68 grants have been awarded, covering a wide range of themes, and you can see some of the examples that we've provided in the Dropbox. And as I've mentioned, I'm in the Research and Scholarship Committee, and this is coordinated by John Peters from Newman University, and Jenny's also in that, and there are a few of us who we're involved in evaluating the grants applications when they come in, and so that's one of my roles, and that's obviously why we're here today. So I'm just having a quick look at my notes. One of the things it mentions here is the themes for the educational development grants are huge. They can vary. There's nothing one particular thing that sort of dominates. So we have some examples here from the Lecture from Hell, which is a recent project which looks at the experience of disabled students for able-bodied educational developers and academics, so it's simulating that experience. And then we also have something around professional learning of expert teachers in higher education. So there isn't one thing that we sort of focus on, and we'll look at in more detail about sort of what we require in terms of the application process. So I'll just go on to the next slide. So there we go. So what makes a good grant idea? I've already mentioned the notion of educational development. And so it has to be something of relevance, not just within your own institution, but something that has relevance outside the institution and potentially to the HE community, and particularly those who are in educational development roles. Although you may not be in one yourself, that's not an issue. The other thing is that we ask that you build on a recognised body of work, including previous grants. So please have a look at the SEDA grants that have already been awarded, and also the wider literature. And we come on to that in a moment, where we ask you, for example, to refer to the wider educational literature that will support your research. And finally, we would like you to identify the reach, value, impact and legacy of your project. And again, that's something that we'll come on to in more detail. I'll just check my notes again. So I think one of the things here that is saying that it's a very good idea, if you have an idea for a grant, is to sort of test them out in the wider, with your colleagues. Have a see what is of either something that is very current within the wider HE sector, within teaching and learning and educational development, or alternatively something, some of the grants that we award are for things that haven't really been given a focus. So you could find, for example, the idea of simulating the experience of disabled students. We've also had things around the use of sort of theatre within educational development. One of the projects that I'm currently mentoring relates to the idea of the teacher as sort of counsellor and coach. So there are things that, you sort of need to contextualise your project within the wider literature and within the wider research. But at the same time, there may be something that you spot that just hasn't been done. And that can also make a good idea for a project. So in terms of methodology, I mean, it's a small application form, so but we do require you to be quite sort of clear about the methodology you're using, including the philosophical position and also sort of practical implementation, and also something that's replicable. So the idea of the project of one of the grants that you might produce is something that someone else in a similar position in a different university, for example, can try for themselves. So obviously it will be context specific, that there will be things that are particular to your institution, your practice, your students. But in terms of the methodology, what we're looking for is something that other people can then learn from and try out for themselves. I think this is one of the big features of the SEDA grant application, that we really need to see some evidence that this isn't just something that can only operate within your own context, within your own institution. And again, here it's important to indicate things like the ethics involved, how you will use the data, how you will communicate with students around the nature of the research, as again you would expect for a normal research project. And also here, there's a thing here about the accountability of tasks and people's roles. So yes, it's a small amount of funding, but we do also ask that you just make it clear who will be doing what in terms of the project. And we'll come on to something around the funding related to that in a moment. I was going to say, Jenny, if you hear anything that I'm missing, then please cut in and I'll be very happy to add it.
Okay, no worries.
Yep, okay, so in terms of the project plan, you don't necessarily need to do a Gantt chart, but it is quite helpful to have a sense of what will be done at what point. So again, so that we can look to see how feasible the project is. If it's something that is one person has indicated taking X months, we may then have worries about whether you will actually be able to do that in practice. And also think, as it says here, about just making sure there's an alignment between the plan and actually what you have set out to achieve. We're also, obviously, because it is a small amount of money, but therefore there needs to be some element of value for money here. So for example, examples of this might be match funding from your institution, the idea of sort of staff time pro bono. So it's very unlikely that £1,000 would be able to cover the costs of someone doing an aspect of the project. So ideally that should be something that's provided by your own institution, and that the funding that we provide is for something that would be in addition to that you might not normally have been able to provide within your institutional context. And also, as I've mentioned before, we said about the sort of replicability of the project. We want to see about some idea about impact and project outcomes. What will be the sort of the take home at the end of this? It could be something that other institutions could use. It could be a report that sort of informs the wider sector. There's also a requirement to submit something to the SEDA conference. So, but in addition to that, it's often helpful to have something that someone can say, right, okay, if I were to do this within my own institution, how could I do it? So having some sense of, a toolkit or something like that is often really helpful. But, and it mentions this finally, I mean, if it's you doing this on your own, you are one person, and obviously we take that into account. And if we saw something that was super, sort of big and exciting, undertaken by one person, then we might worry whether you'll be able to do it. So obviously do make clear in your application, who will be doing what and where that responsibility lies, so we can get a good picture of what your actual involvement will be. And this involves collaboration beyond the individual's immediate setting. I think that's one of the sort of really big things that we look at, that we want to see something where you're collaborating. Perhaps it could be within an institution, but across departments, say, that perhaps don't normally have any form of contact between them. It could be across different institutions. We have one this time that's involved in institutions within different countries, for example. So I think you can see here that we want to see some example of collaboration, whether it's between individuals or even as one of the projects that we're currently supporting at an international level. One of the other ways in which we can sort of look for collaboration is between people of different roles. So it could be that you're an educational or academic developer and wish to work with someone in a department, or it could be that you're a lecturer working with another lecturer within a different institution, or say someone in professional services, or indeed with students. So that's how collaboration sort of works in relation to roles. I think also it may be that you have formal networks that you're already engaged with. So for example, through SEDA, or through sort of regional networks across institutions. So please put that in as well, particularly if your project relates to those. Obviously, if it's not relevant, then don't include it. But if you're trying to do a project involving other institutions and you already have links with those institutions through those networks, then that's a really important way to ensure that we understand the nature of that collaboration. And the final 2 points here relate to diversity, to what extent the nature of the collaboration is diverse, encourages people, for example, from BAME backgrounds, people who are perhaps underrepresented in this sort of research. So I think, again, that's something that we would be interested in, so that we're trying to, when we're evaluating the projects, we're often trying to get a nice spread across the different projects that are there. So we get so something that includes groups who might not normally be represented would be something that we would be very much interested in supporting. So the next one here is to do with the implications for educational development beyond your immediate practice. So again, I've already mentioned before that the idea is it's not something that obviously will provide you with perhaps with support for evaluating a project within your own institution, but it's important in terms of the SEDA grants that we also look at impact and legacy beyond your own institution. So I've mentioned things like toolkits, which can be really useful, something that will give an idea about, other people, colleagues in other institutions, ways of taking what you have done within your own institution forward. And it says here, if it's a single or limited case, then, what will you do in order to try and enhance reach, impact and value? So there are obviously the conferences, how you share ideas perhaps within sort of regional groupings of institutions, that sort of thing. And as I said, that relates to the dissemination. We want to see how the project is going to have sort of wings beyond your own context. And so this is where things like, digital resources, publications, conferences, I've already mentioned the SEDA conference, come in. And you've also got the various sort of networks that you're probably already engaged with, but we'd like to see evidence of that in your application as well. So one of the things we also ask for is evidence of your own experience or interest in pedagogic research and evaluation. So, whatever you have in that domain, it may be that you're not an educational developer by background, but if you've done any innovations in teaching and learning, you have publications, and then please mention them here. I think it's also worth adding at this point that we also have one project which is set aside for a developing sort of researcher. Jenny, that's still the case, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely is.
Yeah. So if so, and there is space on the form for you to identify that. So obviously all this relates to people who already have experience. If you are quite new to the field of sort of educational development and research, then please do make sure that you tick that on the application form, because we do look at those within the context of your experience. I think this is you, is it, Jenny?
Yep, that's me.
Okay,
so that's me. And I'll start.
Yes, certainly.
Except it doesn't want to let me. Could you continue sharing, please?
Yes, of course. Are you having problems?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll be your little helper.
Thanks.
I think I might just go from the start and then, oh, there we go, it's come straight up.
Okay, great, okay. Thank you. So thanks, Laura. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking to you about some of the benefits of both applying for and, achieving a SEDA Small Grant. So although the SEDA money is quite a modest amount, it really does carry quite a lot of weight. There's certainly a prestige about the number, evidenced by the number of people who are here today and the number of groups that tend to apply for it. And this, this is evidence because SEDA represents value, people know SEDA, and so the grants do carry some kudos. The SEDA grants are also really valuable because there is evidence of a shrinking funding base for pedagogic research across the sector. And I went to a wonky event earlier this year where it was suggested that there was no, method level teaching development money across the sector. And although I hope that that's not true, I think it is getting harder to get hold of, particularly of this sort of scale of money, the modest amount of money, I mean. And so it's a very valuable commodity. The grants themselves can be extremely beneficial, both for ourselves and also for our institutions. We can use the SEDA Small Grants money to undertake a project which can sort of start to kickstart other things like other applications for research monies, for things like feeding into NTFs, PFs, SFs and SEDA fellowship applications as well. And I don't think that the benefits are necessarily just for individuals either, because institutions also can gain quite a lot of benefit from the research that is undertaken using the SEDA Small Grants within that institution. And I've seen evidence of where they've fed into sort of institutional TEF narratives, or if they've been undertaken with a discipline. I know that there was potential or impetus to feed into TEF subject-specific narratives as well. And even if all fails and a grant application is put together, but it's not necessarily successful, I do think there's a real value in the the time and effort taken to bring an idea together and to operationalise it and articulate it in a way to present it to the SEDA Small Grants Committee. Can I have the next slide, please? Thanks.
Yes, certainly.
Could you give it another click?
Yeah.
I wanted to give you a couple of examples of case studies where this has happened, and I'm just going to start with one from my own work. And this was the first SEDA Small Grants that I achieved back in 2014. And it was a small scale study. Like most SEDA grants, it was just £1,000. And I used that money to explore how a contemporary art gallery could be used to promote disciplinary specific metacognitive strategies in students. So taking students into art galleries and forcing them to stay for a lot longer than they seemed comfortable with, to try and get them to make connections between what they were seeing, what they were doing, the processes they were going through to make sense of the art, and link that back to their disciplinary contexts. It wasn't a huge project. About 70 students participated in it, but it had really, really clear implications for students, for staff, and also very importantly for educational developers. From this very kind of small beginnings, activities developed which included SEDA and other conference presentations, and a publication which started to gain quite a bit of interest. The project itself was celebrated within the institution, and it gained interest from quite a few members of staff who started wanting to replicate it. So if I could do it with students, what could they do with their own students? And so our education development team worked with these academics to develop and create learning experiences in the gallery. And that work itself then, you know, by this time there's quite a body of work around these small beginnings. And that had benefits for me because it fed into a successful NTF application, a successful PF application. And the real icing on the cake for me from that was being invited to China last year to the Chinese SEDA, to CHED, to keynote about creative opportunities and educational development there. And all of that fed back to this grant. But there weren't just benefits for me from that project. There were benefits from the students who came to the gallery, many of who had small but significant transformative experiences. Some of them had never even been in a contemporary art gallery before. It certainly had implications for sort of mainly widening participation students. It had benefits for the staff that started to participate and get involved. And it had benefits for challenging Chinese educational developers who were suddenly challenged to think about this in a very different way. And all of this came back to this £1,000 grant, so real value for money there. The second case study I wanted to draw your attention to, is by, oh gosh, what is he called? Peter Draper, that's it. And I don't know if any of you know Peter, but he really is a lovely chap. And this is a great impact pathway story. So Peter worked with colleagues to create community of practice activity with staff, and those staff were on teaching and scholarship contracts. And he worked with them to produce tangible scholarly outputs and revise teaching practice by those who were involved. It also enabled those that were involved to take their teaching development forward, to use what they learned through these activities to inform UK PSF applications, both received and advanced HE. And then very importantly, this practice was sort of packaged up and disseminated more widely across the sector. And that's a really key attractor for us when we're looking at what we can fund, because we want people to be able to copy, really, to be able to pick things up and run with them. What's the transferability? How easy would this to be do somewhere else? And Peter's work is a really nice example of that. And it's gone on to influence and impact on lots of people across the sector. And it may be even that some of us in this room have been party to those benefits. Can we go on to the next one, please, Laura? Okay, so those are a couple of case studies of, if we're successful, the sorts of impacts that it can have for us, for others, for students, for our colleagues, and for the institution also. But then let's get back in the room and think, well, okay, so how do we get to that point where we're successful? And Laura's spent some time talking us through what it is that we need to make sure that we're doing in order to have a successful application. But I think it's also very important for us to consider what we need to avoid at all costs, really. So common reasons for why we don't fund. So the project would have definitely happened anyway. Oh, sorry, that's my son interrupting. And there's lots of things around this. The project would have happened anyway, whether we funded it or not. It has already happened. So it's already happened, and we've published it. That's the one that really is a shame when you come across it, because somebody 2 or 3 years ago has already done been awarded something for something that's really similar, which is one of the reasons why we try to stress that it's important to go back through previous bids, and lots of those they're all on the website, the details of them, to make sure you're not doing the same thing. And if you're doing something similar, to acknowledge to us that you've seen what we've already funded and you're offering how you're building on top of that. Or it's already happened and you just want to tell people about it. And whilst that's a very worthy cause, it's not really what we're interested in funding. We really want to be funding the genesis and the operationalisation of the project itself, and as well as the dissemination of it. Another reason that we don't fund is because it's not actually SEDA relevant. And we do tend to get a lot of these. And so the project is about teaching and learning rather than about educational development. And we really need to be very clear right from the outset that we have we're able to articulate what education development is and how the project speaks to it. So we're interested in the support of others to support teaching development, and not just that link necessarily between teaching and learning. So make sure you set your stall out very clearly about that right at the beginning. Scalability, did I say that properly? Scalability and replicability. And again, this is about the point of can we do this elsewhere? We're all so busy across the sector. We want to be able to copy, we want to be able to pick up an idea and run with it in our own context. So to what extent are we going to be able to do that? We will be looking for that when we're funding, and we'll be looking for you to make suggestions for how your project supports that in its dissemination, in its outputs. And I think Laura was talking about toolkits or guidance or resources. Obviously, increasingly those are all web-based, but that sort of thing is attractive to us. And the final one, poorly articulated, written, presented. Taking some time to develop a proper research bid, just because it's £1,000 doesn't mean that we're going to look at things that are very well written. It does matter. We need to be able to make clear sense of it, and if it's not very well presented, then we're probably not going to have a lot of confidence in project managing abilities. So please do take some time to feed into a very sort of polished application. Okay, I think that's those. Okay, so review process and success rate. I think it's always really valuable to know what goes on behind the closed doors and how these decisions are made. And we usually come together a couple of weeks after all the applications have landed, which is late January, and spend a day considering the applications. So as you can see here, each bid is reviewed by at least 2 members of the committee. The review forms that we use look very much like the application forms that you will be filling in, and so we review according to the criteria A through to F, I think it is, that Laura's just spoken about, and that form the structure of the application form. So we are reviewing directly to what it is that you are writing. Each reviewer, before we meet, is allocated a number of projects to review. We do that privately, and we provide qualitative feedback according to the criteria for each of the applications that we look at. And then we make an overall judgment, and there are 4 choices for us to make. So the first one is excellent, fund it basically. The second one is good, which translates as fund it if our funding allows, so if there's space. The third one is weak, should not be funded. And the fourth one is doesn't even meet the criteria. So those are the 4 that we look at, and our conversations take place around those that are rated by 2 of us as excellent or excellent good, etc. So we're immediately sort of shortlisted down to those projects, and then we will have conversations around those, deciding which of it is to fund. And then each reviewer provides feedback that we've done, and then that gets fed back to all of the applicants, everybody who comes back. It's not just that you only get feedback if you are successful. So I think it's quite useful to understand that process. I also think it's useful to be able to see what it is that we are up against. And you can see here the figures for the last 4 years, how many applications, how many were awarded, and we commonly and normally award 5. and the percentage success rate. And you can see that there's some good news here, and that over time the percentage success rate is actually consistently growing. So back from sort of 13–14% up to nearly 21% last year. Just to give you a little bit of sort of context, the British Medical Research Council award rate is about 21%. NERC's about 29%, so we're not out of kilter with the broader sector, but you can see that the awards are popular. So going back to my comments about putting some time in to develop the presentation and the content of them is useful, because there is a healthy competition, let's put it that way, across the field. Okay, Laura, thanks. Now, in the beginning, Laura talked quite a lot about, contextualizing your project within literature. It can be useful, obviously, because this is education development, to have some educational development literature in there. And there are a few suggestions for some sort of starter reading about that. You might have a really clear idea, but you might need some pointers in terms of linking it to an education development perspective. So if you're going to sort of start reading, I would suggest these, and there may be others in the texts that you're aware of in this room that you think would also be useful for this purpose. And if you do, please stick them in the chat for others to be able to see. But Catherine's work is really useful. It's nice and brief and quick, and just as an overview of important issues around academic development right now. So a starter kit there on the basics of pedagogic research, which might be helpful in you thinking of formulating your question, your idea, and the methodology, etc. The Hinton resource is really useful in thinking about dissemination of your project, and how to really start thinking about dissemination impact right from the beginning of your project, and setting out your stall in terms of what that will look like. And Bamba, I know that this work's a bit older, and that recently she's, I think at the moment she's advertising through SEDA a new piece of work about evidencing the value of educational development. But I'm not sure if that's, Louise might be able to tell us if that's actually publicly available or not yet. But is it, Louise?
Oh,
yeah.
Yes, it is.
Oh, is it?
Yes.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, so people can get that through the SEDA website.
Okay, well then I'd suggest that you went and had a look at that one, probably, because this one might be a little out of date by now, but certainly good food for thought. Laura, can I have the next one, please? If there is a next one, I can't remember.
No, I think that's it now.
Okay, all right, fantastic. So, so there you go. There's some ideas about the sorts of things that the Research and Scholarship Committee look for when we are deciding. I think there was one more slide actually, Laura.
Is that? Sorry, bear with me. I've just
I'm sure there is, and it's got all the details for actually when and how and what to do.
Let's have a see.
Yeah, there's a couple more.
Oh yes, they didn't seem to come up. Bear with me.
Okay, so we have the useful reading.
Yeah, there we go.
So yeah, there's some carrying on with that thread. There's some journals that you might want to look at, and I think these slides will be available. So don't worry about trying to memorize all of that straight right now. And the next one, oh, that's the one I was thinking of. So just in terms of next steps, so proposals. All of this information is on the SEDA website. There's an application form that needs to be used. The deadline is the 29th of January next year. Blah de blah. There's the email. Okay, and then if that sort of time scale is, you're thinking, my goodness, that's only just around the corner, then it's never too late, too soon. That's the right way around, to start thinking about a SEDA Small Grant. Sometimes it can take a while to prepare an idea properly, to be able to submit it. So I don't think it's ever too soon to do it. And what can you see on your event horizon, in your institutional context, that might be able to feed into the development of a SEDA idea? So we can think about this, you know, long term in terms of our planning. And I would definitely suggest using SEDA conferences. There's the mailing list to try and you know, garner interest from others. And I know that now there's a SEDA are promoting a series of workshops, and it's not a conference. What's it being called, Louise, in December the 14th? A week of
It is a winter festival, yes, to end the year on a high.
Well, that sounds great. So there are, you know, there are all these sort of refreshed SEDA events that are coming, and use those to network. Like Laura was saying, there's a real emphasis on collaboration and having either between people in the university or between different universities and organisations, and use the SEDA connections and others to be able to build those up. And I think that is probably it on the slides. Now, oh yeah, just some other sources of funding, Erasmus, the Leverhulme, etc. So I'll stop there. I know there's some questions in the chat.
Yep, Louise, could you stop the recording, please?
Yeah.